I understand the charges are serious, but I want to cooperate fully and explain my side of the story.
You know that feeling when a room is so quiet, you can hear the buzz of the lights? Multiply that by 100. That was the courtroom in Cedar Falls on the first day of Jake Thompson's trial. The air wasn't just still, it was heavy. Heavy with anger, with grief, with the need for someone to pay for the unthinkable. And in the center of it all was a boy. A 14-year-old boy who looked about 12, swimming in a stiff, new suit his public defender probably bought for him. He was Jake Thompson. And to every person in that room, he was a monster. The prosecutor, a man named David Croft with a voice that could shake the windows, stood up. He laid out the story for the jury. A story of two boys, best friends, who went into the woods behind the old park. Only one came out. He talked about a life cut short, a family shattered, and a killer who showed no remorse. He painted a picture of Jake as this cold, disturbed kid, warped by violent games, who just snapped. And the whole time he's saying these horrible, gut-wrenching things. Where is Jake? He's not crying. He's not hanging his head in shame. He's sitting perfectly still at the defense table, a cheap sketch pad and a pencil in front of him. And he's drawing. Just calmly sketching. And on his face, this faint, distant, almost peaceful little smile. I was his lawyer, Sarah Miller. And I sat right next to him, watching the jury watch him. I saw their faces harden. I saw the disgust in their eyes. Every time a particularly brutal detail was mentioned, I'd glance at him, praying for a flinch, a tear, anything to show he was human. But there was nothing. Just that calm, empty smile and the soft scratch of his pencil. And then, the worst moment. Leo's mother, a woman hollowed out by pain, let out a choked sob. It was a sound that could break your heart in two. The whole courtroom flinched. Everyone, except Jake. His pencil didn't even pause. He just kept shading whatever he was drawing, that same placid smile on his lips. In that moment, my blood ran cold. Because I thought, for one terrifying second, that everyone else was right. That I was sitting next to a soulless creature. That the monster the newspapers described was real, and he was my client. But then I looked closer. I looked at his eyes. The smile was on his lips, but his eyes were a million miles away. They were empty. Not with evil, but with nothing. Like a TV tuned to a dead channel. And that's when I first wondered, what if the smile wasn't a smirk? What if it was something else entirely? A signal? A symptom? A wall his mind had built so high that nothing, not even this nightmare, could get through. And that tiny, nagging question was the only thing I had to hold on to. This chapter immediately establishes the central mystery and emotional conflict. The language is direct and sensory, buzz of the lights, heavy with anger, choked sob. It introduces the key characters, Jake, Sarah, the prosecutor, and the core problem, Jake's unsettling behavior. It ends with a curiosity gap, making the listener question the easy assumption that Jake is simply evil. The heavy door of the holding cell clanged shut behind me, sealing us in that sterile, windowless room. The smell was all industrial cleaner and cold metal. And there he was, Jake, still in that too-big suit, but he'd shrunk. The strange, public confidence he had in the courtroom was gone. He was just a small boy again, staring at the scuffed floor. I didn't know how to start. I was so frustrated, so terrified for him. So the words just tumbled out. Jake, they think you're a monster. Do you understand that? Every person in that room believes you are evil. So you need to tell me right now. Why were you smiling? He didn't look up. His shoulders hunched. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean in to hear it. I don't know, he whispered. It just happens. Everything gets fuzzy. Like I'm watching a movie about someone else. And my face, it just does that. A movie. He felt like he was watching a movie. That wasn't the answer of a cunning psychopath. That was the confession of a traumatized kid. I pulled out the chair opposite him, the legs screeching on the concrete. Can I see what you were drawing? I asked, my voice softer now. He hesitated, then slowly slid the sketchpad across the table. My heart was pounding. I was expecting something dark, something violent. Monsters, weapons, blood. But that's not what it was. The pages were filled with faces. But they were all wrong. They were blurred, like someone had smudged them before the ink dried. The eyes were often just dark, empty pits. In other spots, he'd just drawn these dense, tangled shapes, like a ball of black yarn or a thicket of thorns. There was no anger in it. There was just confusion, and a deep, profound sadness. I looked from the disturbing, messy sketches back to the boy in front of me. The puzzle pieces weren't fitting together. The monster the prosecutor described would have drawn something different. This was the work of someone who was lost. Someone whose mind was as blurred and tangled as the lines on the page. In that cold little room, my fear started to change shape. It wasn't just fear that I would lose this case. It was a new, chilling kind of fear. The fear that I was defending a boy who wasn't just guilty or innocent, but a boy who might not even be entirely in there. That the real Jake, whoever he was trapped behind a wall his own brain had built. And I had no idea how to find him. Back in the courtroom, it was time for the witnesses. The first one up was a kid named Mark, a friend of both Jake and Leo. He was nervous, shuffling his feet, barely looking up from the floor. The prosecutor, Mr. Croft, approached him like a friendly uncle, his voice all calm and reassuring. "Now, Mark," Croft said, "can you tell us about the relationship between Jake and Leo in the days before the incident?" Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "They were okay, I guess. But they had a fight. A big one." You could feel the entire jury lean forward. A fight. A motive. This is what they were waiting for. What was the fight about? Croft asked, like he was just gently guiding the story out. "It was at school," Mark said. "By the lockers. Leo had this new video game, and he said Jake stole it from his backpack. They were yelling. Jake got right in Leo's face. He was really mad. I'd never seen him that mad before. He shoved Leo, and a teacher had to break it up. The story landed like a hammer. A fight over a stolen game. Jealousy. Anger. It was so simple, so believable. It painted a perfect, terrible picture. Jake, consumed by rage, luring his friend into the woods for revenge. And through it all, Jake just sat there, sketching. That same, faint, untouchable smile on his face. It was like he was listening to a story about complete strangers. I felt a wave of despair. This was it. This was the nail in his coffin. The prosecutor, pleased with himself, turned and pointed right at Jake. So, the defendant was capable of intense anger, wasn't he? He was capable of violence. And as Mark said, "Yes, sir," something happened. It was so fast, you would have missed it if you blinked. The pencil in Jake's hand stopped moving. Just for a second. And that smile on his face, it didn't vanish, but it flickered. Like a light bulb that nearly goes out before surging back on. His head twitched, just a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. For a fraction of a second, his eyes lost that glassy, faraway look and sharpened with something that looked like pain. Real, sharp, emotional pain. Then it was gone. The pencil moved again. The smile settled back into place. The mask was back on. But I saw it. The jury might not have seen it. The cameras definitely missed it. But I saw it. Mr. Croft thought that moment of anger Mark described sealed Jake's guilt. But to me, it did the opposite. That tiny crack in Jake's facade, that little flinch, it was the first real human reaction I'd seen from him since this whole nightmare began. It wasn't the reaction of a remorseless killer being exposed. It was the reaction of someone whose brain had just been poked in a very deep, very old wound. He remembered that fight. He remembered the anger. And for one single, unguarded moment, it hurt him. That crack was everything. It was the first thread I could pull. And I knew, right then, I had to pull it until the whole story unraveled. Later that night, I was buried. My office looked like a paper bomb had gone off. Files and coffee cups everywhere. My head was throbbing. I kept seeing it, that tiny flicker on Jake's face when Mark mentioned the fight. It was real. I knew it was real. But what did it mean? The problem was, I had nothing else to stand on. The entire case against Jake was built on one simple, terrifying idea, that he was a bad kid who finally snapped. And on the surface, it made a sick kind of sense. The fight, his quietness, that awful smile in court, it all pointed to one thing. But what if it was pointing to the wrong thing? I was running on coffee and desperation, forcing myself to go back to the very beginning. Before the fight, before the woods, before any of this. I was reading through every single page of the discovery the prosecution had sent over, all the evidence they planned to use to put my client away for life. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose of misery. And then I found it. Tucked in the back of a thick folder labeled Thompson Juvenile History was a photocopy of an old medical report. It was from Cedar Falls General Hospital, dated 4 years ago, when Jake was 10. My eyes were so tired, the words were blurring together. But I forced myself to read it. It was an emergency room report. It described an accident at Miller's Pond, the old swimming hole on the edge of town. The report said Jake had been playing with some older kids. He'd taken a running dive into the water. But he'd misjudged the depth. His head hit the muddy bottom. Hard. The medical terms jumped off the page at me. Severe concussion. Subdural hematoma. Near drowning. Near drowning. He'd been underwater for an unknown amount of time before someone pulled him out. He was unconscious. He was airlifted to a bigger hospital. The report stated he was in a medically induced coma for 2 days. 2 days. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I read on, my fingers leaving sweaty prints on the paper. At the very bottom of the report, in the doctor's notes, was a single, almost offhand sentence. It was probably meant as a footnote for future reference, something that got lost in the shuffle of a busy ER. It read, "Patient sustained a significant traumatic brain injury. Family should monitor for potential long-term effects, including personality changes, emotional dysregulation, and memory fragmentation." The room got very quiet. The hum of my laptop faded away. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Personality changes. Emotional dysregulation. Memory fragmentation. I looked up from the paper, staring at the wall, but I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing Jake in that courtroom. The empty smile. The flat, emotionless eyes. The way he described everything as fuzzy, like he was watching a movie. This wasn't a new Jake. This wasn't a monster who had just appeared. The Jake everyone saw in that courtroom, the one who smiled when he should cry, wasn't the original Jake. He was a boy who had been broken and put back together wrong by a terrible accident 4 years ago. His brain had been rewired by trauma. The anger they saw, the emotional distance, the vacant smile. It wasn't a sign of a guilty conscience. It was a symptom, a scar. The ghost wasn't in the room. It was right here, in this medical file. And for the first time, I felt a real, solid piece of hope. I wasn't just defending a boy who might be innocent. I was defending a boy who was, in a very real way, a victim himself. And I finally had the first clue to prove it. I knew what I had in that medical file was a game changer, but I couldn't just walk into court and say, "Your Honor, he had a boo-boo on his head 4 years ago." I needed to understand what it meant. I needed to get to the Jake who existed before the accident, the one trapped behind that fog. So, I called in reinforcements. Her name was Dr. Irene Evans, a neuropsychologist who specialized in memory and traumatic brain injuries. When I explained Jake's case to her, the accident, the smile, the fuzzy movie feeling, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Sarah, it sounds like his mind built a fortress to protect itself. Our job isn't to break the walls down. It's to find a door." We got permission for a private session in a quiet, soft-lit room at the Juvenile Detention Center. No lawyers, no guards. Just Dr. Evans, Jake, and me, sitting off to the side, holding my breath. Dr. Evans didn't push him. Her voice was like a warm blanket. "Jake," she said, "I don't want you to try and remember the hard part today. I just want to try and find the last clear, good memory you have from that afternoon. Can we try that?" Jake, looking small and scared, nodded slowly. "Okay," Dr. Evans said softly. "Close your eyes if it helps. Take yourself back. You and Leo are heading into the woods. What's the first thing you feel? Not think. Feel." There was a long silence. I watched Jake's face, searching for that blank smile, but it wasn't there. He was just a boy, concentrating. "The sun," he whispered, his eyes still closed. "It was hot on my neck. But then the trees, it got cooler." "Good," Dr. Evans murmured. "That's really good. What do you smell?" Jake's nose wrinkled slightly. "The pine. It was really strong. And the dirt. It had rained that morning, so it was that wet mud smell." My pen was frozen over my notepad. This was the most detailed, present he had ever been. "Now, what do you hear?" Dr. Evans asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake was quiet again, listening to a memory. Our feet crunching on the sticks. And a dog. A dog barking really far away. From the miller's farm, I think. He paused, and then the faintest hint of a real, genuine smile touched his lips. "And Leo. He was talking a mile a minute. He was so excited. He said he couldn't wait to show me. He said it was our secret. He was so excited." The air in the room changed. This wasn't the story of two boys about to fight. This was the story of two friends on an adventure. Leo was excited. Jake was following him, feeling the sun, smelling the pine. They were going to their fort. "And this thing he was going to show you," Dr. Evans pressed gently. "Did he give it a name? What did it look like?" Jake's forehead furrowed. The concentration was intense. He was right there, on the edge of it. It was old. He found it in the creek. He said it was shiny but dirty. He said it was. Suddenly, Jake's hands flew to his temples. He winced, his eyes snapping open. "My head," he gasped. It hurts. It's like a door slamming shut." He shut down. The connection was broken. The fog rolled back in. But it didn't matter. For a few precious minutes, we had seen a glimpse of the real Jake. And more importantly, we had a road map. We knew the path his memory took, the sun, the pine, the distant dog, the excitement. And we knew the trigger, the old shiny, dirty thing Leo had found. We didn't have the whole story yet. But we finally knew where to dig. And we knew, without a doubt, that the boy who walked into those woods was not a killer. He was just a kid, following his best friend on a summer day. If the first day of the trial was about stories and whispers, the second day was about things. Cold, hard, physical things. And the prosecution had a thing that was about to slam into our case like a freight train. It was the day for the forensic evidence. The jury was leaning forward, ready for the facts, the stuff you can't argue with. And Mr. Croft, the prosecutor, was happy to give it to them. He called a forensic expert to the stand, a woman with a no-nonsense voice who described a shovel. A simple, dirt-caked garden shovel, found half buried under a pile of leaves about 50 yards from the site. She described the soil on the blade. "It's a perfect match," she said, "to the soil composition from the disturbed earth where the victim was found." Then came the part everyone was waiting for. The fingerprints. The handle of the shovel, the expert said, looking directly at the jury, was wiped clean, smudged, except for one perfect thumbprint. She paused, letting the silence build. That print was a match for the defendant, Jacob Thompson. A wave of sound, gasps, murmurs, rippled through the courtroom. It was the sound of a case being closed. I felt sick. You can argue about moods and smiles all day long, but you can't argue with a fingerprint. It's just there. And as if on cue, I saw Jake start to change beside me. As the expert talked about the shovel, about the dirt, about his print, that vacant smile began to spread across his face again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't faint or distant. It was wide, unnerving. A big, toothy grin that looked completely out of place on a boy being accused of murder. The jurors stared at him, their faces a mix of horror and disgust. One woman actually shook her head and looked away. This was the image they would take with them into the deliberation room, the smirking killer, unmoved by the damning evidence against him. And then, it got worse. From the row behind the prosecution's table, Leo's father stood up. He was a big man, broken by grief, and the sight of Jake smiling at that moment was too much for him to bear. "Monster!" he roared, his voice cracking with a pain so raw it hurt to hear. "You're a monster!" The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Two bailiffs rushed over, gently but firmly guiding Mr. Mitchell out of the room. His sobs echoed in the hallway before the door closed behind him. The entire courtroom was frozen. And through it all, Jake just kept smiling that horrible, wide, empty smile. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to scream, "Stop! Can't you see what you're doing?" But as I turned to him, about to whisper something, anything, I saw what I hadn't seen before. His hands were under the table, clenched into white-knuckled fists, so tight they were trembling. The smile was plastered on his face, but his body was a statue of pure tension. He was gripping the edge of his seat like he was holding on for dear life. And in that moment, I finally understood. The smile wasn't a smirk. It wasn't joy or remorselessness. It was a panic button. When the world became too much, when the pressure and the horror got too intense, his brain, the one injured and rewired by that childhood accident, didn't know how to cry or scream. It only knew one way to react. It forced his face into this grotesque parody of a smile. It was a shield. A desperate, biological defense mechanism against a reality too terrible to face. The damning shovel, the angry father, the disgusted jury, it was all too much for him. So his mind retreated, and the smile was the flag it raised on the empty fortress. The evidence looked bad. It looked conclusive. But looking at my client's white knuckles and his terrified, smiling eyes, I knew, with every fiber of my being, that we were all misreading the signs. The shovel didn't prove he was a killer. It just proved he was there. And we still had no idea what really happened. Just when I thought the case couldn't get any worse for us, the prosecution called their final witness. And it was the one person I was dreading most. Maya. Leo's older sister. The girl who used to let Jake and Leo have cookies in her kitchen after school. The girl Jake had a shy, quiet crush on for years. Seeing her walk to the stand was like a knife to the heart. She was so poised, so composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed and full of a sadness that felt ancient. Mr. Croft knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just about testimony. This was about emotion. He was putting a face on the loss, and showing the jury that even someone who knew Jake, who cared for him, was now convinced of his guilt. "Maya," Croft began, his voice gentle, respectful. "Can you describe Jake for us?" Before all of this, Maya looked directly at Jake, and her gaze wasn't angry. It was just terribly sad. "He was quiet," she said, her voice clear but soft. "Always quiet. But after his accident at the pond, he changed. He got darker, more withdrawn. He had these bursts of anger over little things. It was like the sweet boy I knew was just gone. Each word was a hammer blow. Darker, withdrawn, anger." She was confirming the prosecution's entire narrative, and she was doing it with a heartbreaking sincerity that was 1,000 times more powerful than any expert's opinion. I glanced at Jake. The smile was back, that brittle, defensive mask. But his eyes were fixed on Maya, and I could see a storm brewing behind them. Then, Croft asked the million-dollar question. "Maya, on the day your brother died, did he say anything to you? Did he seem different?" Maya nodded, dabbing a tissue to her eyes. "He was excited. He said he and Jake were going to their fort in the pines. He said he had to finally show Jake something. An old thing he'd found in the creek weeks before. He said it was their secret. An old thing. The words from Jake's memory session echoed in my head. Old. Shiny. Dirty. The prosecutor puffed out his chest, ready to land his final blow. So, Leo was going to show Jake this thing. This secret. And that was the last time you saw your brother alive. But he never got his answer. Because Jake jerked in his seat beside me as if he'd been electrocuted. His whole body spasmed. The sketchpad and pencil clattered to the floor. That horrifying, placid smile vanished, wiped away like it had never been there. His eyes were wide, wild, terrified. He wasn't looking at Maya anymore. He was staring at nothing, seeing everything. "The locket," he gasped, the words torn from him. He found the silver locket. The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed his gavel. "Counselor, control your client." But I wasn't listening. I was staring at Jake, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. This was it. This was the crack we'd been waiting for, and it wasn't a crack anymore, it was a chasm. I leaned in close, my voice a desperate whisper, blocking out the chaos around us. "Jake, what locket? What are you talking about?" He turned to me, his eyes finally, truly focused. For the first time, he was completely present, and what I saw in his face was pure, unadulterated terror. "It was in the creek," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Leo found it. It was tarnished, silver. He pried it open. There was a picture of a girl inside. A girl we didn't know. He was scared of it. He said it felt wrong. He said we had to bury it again. That's why we had the shovel." The world tilted on its axis. The shovel. They had the shovel to bury a locket, not to dig a grave. The prosecutor thought Maya's testimony was the final nail in our coffin. But he was wrong. She had just handed us the key. What would you do if you were Sarah? Trust the sudden memory of a traumatized boy, or stick with the damning physical evidence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The second the judge called for a recess, I practically dragged Jake out of that courtroom. The doors hadn't even finished swinging shut behind us before I was pulling him into the closest, smallest consultation room we could find. It was a glorified closet with a table and 2 chairs, but it was private. "Jake," I said, my voice low and urgent. I knelt in front of him so we were eye level. "Look at me. The locket. Tell me everything. Right now." He was breathing in ragged, shaky gulps. The calm, smiling boy was gone, replaced by someone trembling on the edge of a panic attack. The memory was like a live wire in his brain, and he was finally, truly feeling its shock. "It was his secret," Jake started, the words tumbling out. "For weeks. He found it stuck in the mud under the little bridge in the creek. It was silver, but all black and dirty. He thought it was treasure." Jake's eyes darted around the room, seeing the past. He pried it open, and there was a picture inside. A girl with blonde hair. She was smiling, but he said it was a creepy smile. He said the locket felt warm, like it was alive. He got scared. He said we had to put it back. But he was too scared to go alone. This was the excitement Dr. Evans had pulled out of him. The adventure. Not a fight. A mission. "So the shovel," I prompted, my mind racing. "We took it from my garage," Jake said, nodding fast. "To dig a deep hole by the fort. To bury it for good, so no one would ever find it. That's all we were doing. We were just burying it." He remembered the sun through the pine needles. He remembered the smell of the wet earth as they started to dig. He remembered Leo joking, the fear finally lifting now that they were doing something about it. And then, Jake's face went blank again, but this time it wasn't the empty fog. It was the dark, terrifying kind of blank. "I was digging," he whispered. The hole was getting deep. Leo was watching the trees, saying he felt like someone was watching us. And then, there was just a crack. A sharp, white pain. Right here. He pointed to the back of his head. And then I was on the ground, my face in the dirt. I couldn't move. I couldn't see right. Everything was spinning and red. My blood ran cold. He was describing a blow to the head, a traumatic impact, the exact kind of impact that could trigger memory loss in a brain with his history. "Jake," I said, barely breathing. "What did you see?" He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting against the pain, fighting to see through the red haze. "I saw boots. Big, heavy work boots, right next to my face. And I saw someone else digging. Fast. Frantic. Using our shovel. I saw Leo's sneakers. He wasn't moving. He was just lying there." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a horror so profound it stole the air from the room. "I didn't bury Leo, Ms. Miller," he choked out, a single desperate tear finally escaping and tracing a clean line down his cheek. "I was trying to bury a secret. And someone else was there. Someone else buried my best friend." The puzzle pieces didn't just fit together. They exploded and reformed into a completely different picture. The shovel with his fingerprint? Of course it had his print. It was his shovel from his garage. He was the last one to hold it before everything went wrong. The smile, the confusion, the memory loss, it wasn't guilt. It was the aftermath. He hadn't committed a murder. He had witnessed one. He had been the first victim, knocked unconscious, his brain scrambling to protect him from the unimaginable horror he saw. The monster wasn't in the suit beside me. The monster was still out there. And we had just stumbled onto his trail. We had a theory now. A terrifying, game-changing theory. But a theory isn't proof. We needed details. We needed a face. And the only place that face existed was locked inside Jake's broken memory. Dr. Evans came back that same night. The room was quiet. The lights were dim. Jake was exhausted, emotionally raw, but he was ready. He knew now that the monster in his memories wasn't him. And that gave him a courage I'd never seen in him before. "Jake," Dr. Evans said softly, "you've been so brave. You remembered the locket. You remembered the shovel. Now, I need you to go back to that moment. You're on the ground. You see the boots. Can you look up? Just a little." Jake closed his eyes, his breathing becoming slow and deliberate. I held my pen so tightly I thought it might snap. "It's hard," he whispered, his face tense with effort. "Everything is tilting. My head is screaming." "That's okay," Dr. Evans cooed. "Just a glance. A snapshot. What do you see?" A long silence. Then, Jake's voice, thin and strained. "Jeans. Dark blue jeans. And a plaid shirt. Red and black." My heart jumped. A description. We had a description. "Good, Jake, that's so good. Is he tall? Short?" "Tall," Jake breathed out. "So tall. Like a giant. He's digging. The shovel is going in and out of the ground. Fast. Like he's done it before." The casual, horrifying efficiency of it made my stomach turn. "Now, Jake," Dr. Evans said, her voice steady as a rock. "This is the most important part. I need you to look at his hands. He's holding the shovel. Can you see his hands?" Jake flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk. He was there. He was right back in that moment, watching a ghost bury his best friend. The shovel. It has a wooden handle. His grip is tight. Jake's voice was trembling now. And on his hand, on his right hand. He stopped. A small, strangled sound escaped his throat. "What is it, Jake?" I whispered, leaning forward. "A ring," he gasped. "A silver ring. With a big, dark stone. It catches the light through the trees. It flashes." The image was crystal clear. A tall man in a red and black plaid shirt and a silver ring with a dark stone. It was no longer a shadow. It was a person. And then, Dr. Evans prompted gently, "What does he do?" Jake's eyes snapped open. They were wide with a pure, childlike terror I will never forget. "He stops digging," Jake said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "He hears me. He hears me breathing. And he turns. He turns and he looks right at me." The room went cold. "He looks right at you?" Dr. Evans confirmed, her own professional calm seeming to fray at the edges. Jake nodded, a single frantic tear rolling down his cheek. "His face is in the shadows. I can't see it, but I can see his eyes. They're empty." And he takes a step towards me. He lifts the shovel, not to dig, to swing. Jake hugged himself, rocking slightly in his chair. And then the movie, it just stops. The screen goes black. That's all there is. He didn't remember being struck. His mind, in its ultimate act of mercy, had shut down completely before the final blow could land. It had hidden the face of the murderer to save the boy who saw it. But it had given us everything else. The clothes, the height, and most importantly, the ring. The man with the ring hadn't just killed Leo. He'd tried to kill Jake, too. And he'd almost gotten away with it by letting a traumatized boy take the fall. We had our ghost. And now, we knew what he was wearing. A tall man. A red and black plaid shirt. A silver ring with a dark stone. It was something. It was more than we had an hour ago. But it wasn't enough. You can't walk into a courtroom and say, "My client remembered a ring." We needed proof. We needed a photograph. A witness. Something to tie this ghost to the real world. And I knew exactly where to look. While Dr. Evans stayed with Jake, I ran back to my office. The sun had set. The town of Cedar Falls was quiet, but my mind was screaming. I logged into the secure portal for the case files. The prosecution had to share all their evidence with us, and that included the crime scene photos. Thousands of them. I started clicking. It was a digital haystack, and I was looking for a needle I couldn't even see clearly. Pictures of the dirt, the trees, the fort from every angle. Pictures of the grave. I clicked through them, my eyes burning, the image of the ring seared into my brain. Click. A close-up of a root. Click. A wide shot of the clearing. Click. A measuring tape next to an indent in the soil. I was looking for the wrong thing. I was looking for a close-up of a man's hand, and that was never going to be there. I needed to shift my perspective. I remembered what the forensic expert said. The shovel was found 50 yards away. Why so far? Did he drop it? Throw it? I pulled up the photos tagged, "Shovel Recovery." There were shots of the shovel lying under a pile of leaves. And then, wider shots, showing the shovel's location in relation to the rest of the scene. These wider shots included the tree line. And just beyond the tree line, a worn path that led to the main road into the park. My cursor hovered over one particular photo. It was taken from the site, looking back towards the road. In the distance, beyond the yellow police tape, you could see a small crowd of onlookers. People from town, drawn by the sirens and the commotion, held back by uniformed officers. The media was there, too. Their cameras were pointed at the crime scene. But one man wasn't. He was standing a little apart from the main group, half hidden in the shade of a large oak tree. He wasn't looking at the cameras. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was staring, with an intense, focused stillness, right at the spot where the police were digging. My breath hitched. I zoomed in. The image was grainy, the man was far away. But I could see him. Tall. A red and black plaid shirt. And on his right hand, raised slightly as he scratched his cheek, was a flash of metal. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred, my heart hammering against my ribs. I adjusted the contrast, sharpened the image. There it was. A silver band. With a large, dark, rectangular stone. Time stopped. The buzzing of my computer, the hum of the office lights, it all faded into a dull roar in my ears. I was looking at him. The ghost. The man from Jake's memory. He hadn't fled. He'd come back. He'd stood there and watched them uncover his work. And I knew him. It was Frank. Frank, the town's groundskeeper. The guy who'd been maintaining Cedar Falls Park for 20 years. The friendly, quiet man who always waved when you drove by, who knew every trail, every tree. The man everyone trusted. The man whose job gave him the perfect excuse to be anywhere in those woods, with a shovel, and no one would ever think twice about it. He wasn't just a face in a crowd. He was a part of the town's furniture. And he had been standing right there, watching, while a child took the blame for his crime. I leaned back in my chair, my hands trembling. We had him. Not with a memory, but with a photograph. The ring was real. The man was real. And he was closer than anyone could have ever imagined. I didn't sleep. How could I? I had the face. I had the ring. But I needed the why. Why would Frank, the gentle groundskeeper who taught kids to fish in the creek, do something like this? What could possibly connect him to a silver locket and the death of a child? It couldn't just be random. The locket was the key. Jake said Leo was scared of it, that it felt wrong. What was in that locket? I spent the rest of the night buried in my computer, the blue light my only companion. I started searching, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I looked up old news reports from Cedar Falls and the surrounding counties. Missing persons. Cold cases. I didn't even know what I was looking for, just a thread to pull. And then I found it. An article from 22 years ago. From the next county over. The headline was small, but it screamed at me, still searching, family holds hope for missing teen Emily Reed. My blood went cold. Emily Reed was 15 when she vanished after school. She was last seen wearing a blue dress and a silver locket. A family heirloom. Her grandmother's. The article included a grainy photo of her, and a clearer, separate photo of the locket itself. A tarnished silver heart. It was the same one. I read on, my heart in my throat. The case went cold. No body was ever found. No suspects were ever named. The investigation just faded away. But one detail, one tiny, almost invisible detail buried deep in a follow-up article, made my entire world narrow to a single, horrifying point. The article mentioned that in the early days of the investigation, police had questioned several individuals who frequented the area where Emily was last seen. One of them was a young, part-time groundskeeper for the county parks. A kid named Frank Abbott, who had been cooperative but had a solid alibi. Frank. He was there. He was there then, too. The pieces slammed together with a force that left me dizzy. Leo, poking around in the creek, finds a locket lost for 2 decades. He shows it around, maybe even shows it to the friendly groundskeeper he sees every day in the park. He tells Frank he found it in the creek. And Frank would have known exactly what it was. He would have known that after 20 years of safety, this one piece of evidence, this proof of his old crime, had just washed up out of the past. Leo and Jake weren't just 2 kids with a secret. They were living witnesses to a murder he thought was forever buried. So he followed them. He waited for his moment. He used their own shovel to silence Leo forever. And he would have silenced Jake too, if the boy's brain hadn't shut down and hidden the memory, making him the perfect, silent fall guy. Frank wasn't just a killer. He was a keeper of secrets. He'd been tending these woods for 20 years, not out of love for nature, but as a guardian of his own dark grave. He was watching over the place where he'd hidden his first victim, until 2 curious boys almost dug the whole terrible truth up. The friendly groundskeeper. The man everyone waved to. He wasn't just a man. He was a snake coiled at the heart of this town, and we had just stumbled right into his nest. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. It felt like the calm before a storm. I walked in, and I didn't have a legal pad. I had a single manila folder. Inside it was the grainy photo of Frank, the news article about Emily Reed, and a printout of his employment record showing he worked for the county parks 22 years ago. Mr. Croft saw me and gave me a thin, confident smile. He thought I was beaten. He was about to give his closing argument, to tie a perfect bow on this perfect case. He had no idea I was about to light the whole thing on fire. The judge took his seat. "Mr. Croft, are you ready to proceed?" Before Croft could even stand, I was on my feet. My heart was a drum in my chest. "Your Honor," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I beg the court's indulgence. I need to approach the bench. Immediately. It concerns new, exculpatory evidence of the most urgent nature." The judge frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "Ms. Miller, this is highly irregular. I am aware, Your Honor. But a man's life is at stake, and what I have cannot wait." He stared at me for a long moment, then gestured for Mr. Croft and me to come forward. We huddled around the judge's high desk, out of earshot of the jury. "Your Honor," Croft hissed, "this is a stunt. She has nothing." I didn't look at him. I opened the folder and slid it toward the judge. "Your Honor, the man in that photograph is Frank Abbott, the town groundskeeper. The ring on his hand matches the description my client recalled after a breakthrough in his memory therapy. That ring connects him to the unsolved disappearance of Emily Reed 22 years ago." I pointed to the article. She was last seen wearing the silver locket that the victim, Leo, found in the creek. My client and Leo were not at the woods to fight. They were there to bury that locket. Frank Abbott discovered this and murdered Leo to protect his secret. He then attempted to murder my client, whose traumatic brain injury caused the memory loss that made him appear guilty. The judge's eyes scanned the documents. I watched his face change. The impatience melted away, replaced by a slow dawning horror. He was a smart man. He could see the threads connecting. Croft was sputtering. This is insanity. Recovered memory. A cold case. This is a desperate fantasy." "Is it, David?" I said, turning to him for the first time, my voice low. "Then explain why Frank Abbott is in the crowd at my client's crime scene, staring at the excavation like a predator watching his trap. Explain the ring. Explain why a groundskeeper for 20 years was questioned in the disappearance of Emily Reed." Croft looked from me to the judge, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his confidence. He saw it, too. The judge saw it. The judge looked up, his face grim. "Where is Frank Abbott now?" "He's probably outside, Your Honor," I said. "He watches the proceedings. Every day." The judge didn't hesitate. He motioned for the head bailiff. He spoke in a low, urgent whisper. A few seconds later, 2 bailiffs moved swiftly and silently out of the courtroom. The room had gone dead quiet. The jury was confused. Jake was staring at me, his eyes huge. No one knew what was happening. And then we heard it. From the hallway outside the main doors, a raised voice. A scuffle. The sound of a struggle. The courtroom doors burst open. One of the bailiffs stood there, his face flushed. "Your Honor, we have him. He was trying to run. We found this on him." The bailiff held up a small, tarnished object, dangling from his gloved hand. A silver locket. The gasp that went through the room was a living thing. Leo's mother let out a small, broken cry. The jury was on their feet, straining to see. And Jake Thompson, the boy they all called a monster, looked at that locket, and his entire body went limp with relief. He started to cry. Not the silent tears of before, but deep, heaving sobs that shook his small frame. The sound of a soul being released from a prison it never should have been in. The judge slammed his gavel, but it was too late. The reckoning had arrived. It wasn't in a verdict. It was in that hallway, with the frantic struggle of a guilty man, and in the simple, tarnished piece of silver that proved, beyond any doubt, that the real monster had just been caught. The chaos in the courtroom took a long time to settle. The air was thick with shock, with whispered questions, with the raw, exposed nerve of a truth that no one was prepared for. Frank was gone, taken into custody, his secret finally out. But for us, in that room, one thing still remained unfinished. The judge, an old man who had seen every kind of human misery play out before his bench, looked weary to his bones. He waited for the noise to die down completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy, like stones dropping into deep water. "This court," he began, his eyes scanning the room, "has witnessed a terrible failure. A failure of perception. A rush to judgment." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We were so ready to see a monster that we blinded ourselves to the evidence of a victim." He turned his gaze to the prosecution table. "Mr. Croft, the state's case against Jacob Thompson is built on a foundation that no longer exists. I am therefore dismissing all charges against him. With prejudice." The words dismissing all charges should have felt like a celebration. A victory. But they didn't. They just landed in the silent room, a necessary piece of legal business. Jake was free, but he was still broken. The town was still shattered. Then the judge did something I will never forget. He turned from the law, and he spoke to the heart. He looked directly at Jake, who was still trembling, his face buried in his hands. "This court," the judge said, his voice softening just a little, "and this community owes a profound and lasting apology to Jacob Thompson." Then, slowly, he turned to the Mitchell family. Leo's mother was clinging to her husband, both of them looking utterly lost. "But our duty," the judge continued, his voice growing strong and clear again, "does not end there. Our most sacred duty is to remember the truth, to honor the life that was truly taken. We must never forget, in the shock of this revelation, the boy we all gathered here for. The boy whose life was stolen. The true victim in all of this." He paused, and the entire courtroom seemed to lean in, hanging on his next word. "Was Leo Mitchell." The name. He said the name. Not as an accusation. Not as a piece of evidence. But as a tribute. A final, dignified acknowledgement of a boy who had been lost in the frenzy. And that was what finally broke Jake completely. At the sound of his best friend's name, spoken with such simple, heartbreaking finality, Jake's head snapped up. The last of the walls crumbled. The dissociation, the fog, the protective smile, it all vanished, swept away by a tidal wave of pure, uncomplicated grief. He wasn't the 14-year-old killer anymore. He wasn't the smirking defendant. He was just a boy, Jake, who had just heard his best friend's name, and who finally, fully understood that Leo was gone forever. A low, guttural sob was torn from his chest. Then another. He collapsed forward, his body shaking with the force of a sorrow he'd been unable to feel for months. He was crying for Leo, for their friendship, for the horror he witnessed. He was finally mourning, and the sound of it was the most human, most heartbreaking sound I have ever heard. The camera that had once captured a monster, now captured a victim. And in that moment, everyone in the room finally saw the same boy I saw. There was no sound in the world except for Jake's sobs. That terrible, empty smile was gone, wiped away as if it had never existed. In its place was a raw, unvarnished pain that was almost too much to look at. For months, his face had been a still, quiet mask. Now, it was a storm. Every tear was a memory. Of Leo's laugh, of their secret handshake, of the way they'd race each other to the fort. Every shuddering breath was a confession, of the terror he felt seeing those work boots, of the guilt for surviving when his friend did not, of the crushing weight of being called a monster for a crime he didn't commit. He didn't try to hide it. He couldn't. His body gave out under the weight of it all. He slumped forward, his forehead pressing against the cool wood of the defense table, his shoulders shaking. The cries weren't loud or dramatic. They were deep, guttural, helpless sounds, the kind that come from a place so broken there are no words left. I didn't try to stop him. I just put a hand on his back, a steady anchor in his hurricane. Let them see, I thought. Let them all see. And they did. The jury wasn't looking at a killer anymore. They were watching a child grieve his best friend. The reporters had their cameras trained on him, but the story had changed. They weren't filming a monster. They were documenting a tragedy. I saw Mr. Croft, the prosecutor, look down at his hands, a slow flush of shame rising on his neck. He saw it, too. Leo's mother, her own face streaked with tears, watched Jake, and for the first time, there was no hatred in her eyes. There was just a shared, bottomless sorrow. She was looking at another one of her son's victims. This was the collapse. Not of his case. That was already over. This was the collapse of the fortress his mind had built to survive. The walls were tumbling down, and the Real Jake, the scared, grieving, traumatized boy, was finally stepping out of the ruins. It was the most painful thing I have ever witnessed. But it was also the beginning of his healing. Because you can't start to put the pieces back together until you first allow yourself to fall completely apart. And in that quiet courtroom, surrounded by the people who had condemned him, Jake Thompson finally allowed himself to break.